Buenas tardes a todos y otra vez bienvenidos a este segundo congreso Voces y Acciones ante el Abuso Sexual Infantil.
Moy, no te escucha, Moy.
Mande. Mande. ¿Listos?
Ahora sí.
Ok. Otra vez empiezo. Bienvenidos otra vez a la segunda plática de este segundo encuentro Voces y Acciones ante el Abuso Sexual Infantil organizado por Colbecoag. Nos da mucho gusto tenerlos presentes y me gustaría presentar a la doctora Diane Vines. Voy a presentarla en inglés. Mrs. Diane Vines serves as the Neurosequential Networks Program Coordinator. In this role, she provides both clinical and program-related development, administration, and support individual and site certification programs. Mrs. Vines is also a longtime Child Trauma Academy Fellow and a clinician in private practice. She received her master's degree in marriage and family therapy at the University of Houston, Clear Lake in 1999. Mrs. Vines is a licensed marriage and family therapist supervisor and a licensed professional counselor supervisor in the state of Texas, and is also a registered play therapist supervisor. Mrs. Vines provides individual and family therapy as well as clinical supervision. She has worked, trained, and specialized in the areas of child sexual abuse, incest, and childhood trauma since 1998. And she frequently provides community trainings and case consultations. Mrs. Vines has formerly worked at the Houston Child Advocacy Center. She has also served on Houston Association for Marriage and Family Board and the Kids and Youth Protecting Other Kids Board. Para decir un poco de su experiencia en español, la doctora Vines ha sido coordinadora del modelo secuencial, neurosecuencial, redes de neurosecuenciales, especialista en el área de abuso sexual en la infancia, incesto y trauma infantil. Trabajó en el Child Advocacy Center y fue directora de la Houston Association for Marriage and Family. Asimismo, también fue directora de The Youth Protecting Other Kids. El título de su plática es Empowering Voices Disclosing Abuse, es decir, empoderar las voces para revelar el abuso. Dr. Vines, the microphone is yours. Thank you very much for being with us.
All right, thank you. I actually, let me share my screen again. I pulled up the wrong presentation. Let me see if I can find the right one. In a second. I had it all ready to go and then I pulled up the wrong one. Hang on. Oh man. Let's see. What's here? All right, I'll be right with you in a second. I cannot believe I did this. There it is. Okay, let's share this one. Okay, let me put this with, let me put it here. Okay, let's, All right, let me close this one. Let me do something. I have two PowerPoints open and it will only let me do the one I don't want. So let me see.
You have to close the one you don't want to show.
I just did. Oh, I just did. It is no longer open. And now I cannot find, I can't get it to the one I want. Let me see something. Okay. Oh my goodness. Well, I have never had this happen. Let me see. I cannot believe this is happening. Okay, let me close this. There it is, finally. Oh my goodness. Okay. There, now. Can you see that one?
Yes, yes, we are looking at it.
Thank goodness. Okay, let me get started then. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the sexual abuse. You know, I've been, I did my internship at an advocacy center where that's all we worked with. And I don't know about you guys, but when I told people what I did for a living, they were horrified. And they were just like, oh, well, God bless you for what you do. And they were done talking to me. But actually, it was much more enjoyable work than it sounds. And we saw a whole lot of people get better. And so I really enjoy the topic. I enjoy talking about it, and I enjoy teaching on it, and I enjoy working with it because I see people get better. So, because if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to do it. It's a pretty awful thing. I think you all know that because you specialize in it. This next one. All right. So before we talk about trying to convince someone to talk about their experience, we probably ought to talk about why they don't. So let's talk about what child sexual abuse is, just as a refresher, so we all know that we are on the same page and how it happens and to and by whom. And let's understand that it is hard to tell someone about what's happening when it's happening. It's sometimes hard to tell later too, but it's definitely hard while it's going on. Victims worry about what will happen if they tell and after they tell, and very often they have good reasons for worrying. The idea, the concept of social referencing, which we will talk about, makes it even harder to tell. And we'll talk about why. And people don't usually know how to make that process easier for those who are getting victimized. So it just remains difficult. And if y'all have questions, I hope somebody's moderating this because I can't see the chat, but certainly ask. Okay, so I'm gonna go by what I know, which is what the definition and the treatment and protocols and whatnot in the United States and in Texas. And here, sexual abuse is sexualized activity that takes place between a child or youth that is 3 or more years older than the older person for the sexual gratification of somebody, usually an older person. And the most common place for any child abuse or a neglect of any kind, physical, emotional, sexual, mental abuse to occur is at home by the very people who should be protecting this child from that. So the problem with that, though, is human beings are social. I know that all over the world, people are in social isolation of one degree or another because of COVID. And what we're starting to see from that social isolation, you know, nobody wants to get the virus, but staying home and staying away from people is bringing up a whole other set of problems that are pretty serious. Increased suicides, increased drug abuse, elderly people dying literally from loneliness. That is because humans are social. We need other people. I know here in the States, there are some therapists that use a term called codependent, which I hate that term because it pathologizes, or it can pathologize what is normal social need, which is we need our relationships with other people. Those are so important. We evolutionary in an evolutionary sense, we have lived in clans, and that is of several family groups. And that is how our brains are organized. And that's what we prefer, is to live in groups. That's why most of the time we don't live, I mean, this is a big world. We could spread out a lot more than we do, but we tend to live in cities. Yes, it's convenient, but you also have neighbors, and you also have places of worship, and you also have places to go out to eat and meet with those people, because we want to connect with those people. Now, the other problem with that, though, is we need people, and even babies are aware that they need people, but people are also the biggest predators of people. So while you need them, they can also be potentially very dangerous. So our brains know this. So that is a part of the challenge that we have. All right, so because humans are relational and social, and sexual abuse tends to be relational, because remember, it generally happens at home or through your clan, your connection of people that you know, over 90% of the time. I know that in the United States, we in the past have talked a lot about stranger danger and be aware of people you don't know, and don't go places with adults you don't know, and all that still makes sense. But most of the danger lies in the people that you're supposed to be able to trust. Now, because of that, abuse impacts your relationships and how you form and maintain relationships and what you believe about relationships. And it's not just your relationships at home. You take those lessons that you learn from your relationships at home, from the relationships of the people who are perpetrating this abuse, and you take those tools and those learnings and you take them to other relationships, and you respond to other people with the tools that you have. I know right now I am working with a client who she's 13. She was living with her mother, who wasn't sexually abusive, but she was neglectful and engaged in some criminal activity. We could go on and on. And very inconsistent in her nature. And so what this girl learned is that she learned some really strange, they were adaptive social interaction tools and ways of keeping a person in relationship. They work with her mother, but they really don't work well anywhere else. And so she struggles with relationships with a lot of people, including friends her age. Right now she's living with her dad, and they fight all the time, mostly because of, well, some of it is him, but most of it is her, because she doesn't trust him, and she knows she doesn't. And she has told me, I just expect him to act like my mom, and he's a different person. But she knows that, and it's just a struggle for her to move past that, because the impact her mother has had on her has been so profound. And so that's the paradigm she operates from. So abuse can impact your relationships and your attachment to not only other people, but even to yourself, your relationship to yourself. Disclosing the abuse and not disclosing the abuse can have an impact on your relationships, because it alters how you think. It alters your thoughts about your sense of self, about other people, whether or not you can trust them. You can wind up resenting people who don't pick up your cues and your hints about something going on, and certainly resent the perpetrator. You can even learn to resent yourself because you won't tell. If you tell, you could lose contact with people who are important to you. You could lose your relationship with the perpetrator. Generally the perpetrator is not just 100% bad person. There's a reason that abuse can go on and get worse. And usually it's denial and secrecy, but those are two big factors, but there are others as well. Okay, so there are risk factors to becoming a victim, because not every child makes a good target. But children who are insecure, unhappy, and or lonely, those are neglected or unsupervised, those that crave adult attention or approval, those that are unsupported by family, foster children that live in the child welfare system, those who have lots of different non-family babysitters and caretakers. You'll notice all of those are relationally oriented, every single one of them. Those are point to children who do not have a good network of strong, healthy relationships. Others, mothers sexually abused, I find that interesting because you would think that a mother who had her own sexual abuse history would be extra protective. But the problem with that is that it doesn't recognize that brains are attracted to those things that are familiar, regardless of whether or not they're good or bad. And that is because the brain is a survival organ, and it is always scanning the environment for threat. And one of the things that is most threatening, potentially, is something that is unknown. The unknown scares people. And so your brain will pay a lot of attention to that. When you see, and the irony is that because perpetrators are usually not 100% bad, there's something that the child is often getting, usually some form of attention that they need, that they're getting from the perpetrator. So when they see someone else with that same kind of attention to them, they are attracted to that. Like the mom is, because she got that attention, that kind of attention as a child. It came at a cost. She was abused, but she also got that need for attention met. So when she goes for a partner, she also meets somebody who has those same set of characteristics, but they also tend to come tied to, and they're also abusive. And so they wind up abusing their children. So it's sad, but it's not terribly surprising if you understand how brains work. Previous victims of sexual or physical abuse, they're also hard to believe, because after a while, people start saying, okay, seriously, not everyone can be abusing you. Come on. But sometimes they can. I used to have a lead a group therapy session of preteen girls, and one of the girls used to check in and say, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'm here because I was sexually abused by both of the members of my family, which is a sad check-in, but it just goes to show you that sometimes one person gets away with it and the other people see it, and so they're like, well, I'll be next. I also remember working with a mother who was sexually abused by all of her brothers, and growing up, she thought that was just normal. That's just what brothers did. She didn't find out until later that that's not what brothers do. Not healthy ones and not normal ones. Okay. So, one of the things, there are, I was talking about the attention and codependence and, but people being social. And so that makes children more vulnerable to getting sexually abused. They're more likely to tolerate the abuse because, and I love these three quotes, they're my favorite, some of my favorites, but people will often say, especially after a child makes an outcry and the mother doesn't believe it, she'll just say, oh, they just want attention. And my thought process is, well, they shouldn't have to work that hard to get it. But children don't want attention. They will settle for it. What they want is connection. And actually, you can say that about people. They want connection. They'll settle for attention if that's all they can get. And if they can't get good attention, they'll take the bad. But it's better to ignore it. And that is because humans are social. So this other quote by David Osberger, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. And that is an important idea to hang on to for later when we start talking about how to help people disclose their abuse. It is important to be heard. In fact, just doing this work, I have learned, between doing this work and just being human myself, I have learned that people tend to not listen until they have felt heard. And, you know, anytime you've been in an argument with someone and they clearly feels understand you and they have no idea what you're talking about, all of us tend to find ourselves not listening anymore, our next response, not necessarily because we don't care what that other person thinks, but quite opposite, we do. And it feels like a disruption in relationship and a loss. And so we're trying to reconnect. And part of the way we feel connected and understood is that we feel understood and therefore accepted. Because it's very dangerous to be, it feels dangerous to be ejected from your group. We need to be parts of our group. And this last one is children don't misbehave. They simply behave in a way to get their needs met. So, you know, we very often like to blame kids and they're naughty and they're not behaving well. But there's a reason for it. And a key example is lying. Very often, I'll be talking to a parent or a caseworker and they complain about, well, this kid lies all the time, which, by the way, is a symptom of child sexual abuse. But and they'll want to know what to do about the lying. And my thought is, we don't do anything about the lying. We find out why they're lying, because they're lying for a reason, and we fix that. And once you take care of that, the lying will go away. Okay, so most of the time, sexual abuse doesn't just happen because, and you guys probably already know this, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page. They don't just walk up and start doing it. There's a process called grooming. That's what we call it here. And it is what perpetrators do to select a victim, to get the victim to go along, to get the victim to be quiet, and to make sure that if the victim winds up telling anyway, that nobody believes the victim and they believe the perpetrator. So perpetrators, which is what we call the sex offender, groom the child's other family members, they groom the community, they groom as many people as possible so that they look like a good guy and the child looks like they're lying or crazy or both. And then we've had some notable cases here where people who have pretty much celebrity status, and then it comes out that they're, you know, somebody makes an allegation against them for sexual abuse, and the general public says, oh, not them. That can't be right. They have done all these wonderful things, and they're a good entertainer, they're this and that. So I can't believe, I think that person just wants money, or they just, and the reason they say that is because the perpetrator has done a good job of grooming everyone. So, but for the child, they may provide them with special treatment. And when you think about who the typical victim is, who's the most vulnerable, it's kids who are basically feel ignored. They're lonely, they're unsupported by adults. And here comes one that's not only willing to pay attention to you, but to treat you special. Well, and because we need other people, that makes that child more vulnerable to putting up with all the other things the perpetrator wants to do. They'll make excuses to be alone with children. I remember working with this mother whose daughter was, actually both of her children, daughter and younger son, were sexually abused by her spouse. And it was his stepdaughter, her daughter, but he had been to prison for abusing his own daughter. And then she met him after he got out, and he abused her daughter. They had a child together, and he abused him too. But one of the things he would do is he would offer to babysit when she wanted to go to the club with a cousin, which the average man is out at the club, but he was willing to do it because then he had unimpeded access to the child, to both kids. I knew another woman who had been sexually abused in her family and developed a substance abuse problem to cope with the aftermath of it. And her husband was happy for her to go to rehab and spend 2 or 3 weeks because then he had unimpeded access to their daughter, which is when he would abuse her. So they make excuses to be alone with victims. They will accidentally be naked when children are around, or accidentally on purpose be around naked children. And that's to get kids used to, I'm forgetting the term that I want to use. It's not sensitized, but desensitize them to nudity, which should feel a little weird at some point, but it's to desensitize them to this person being around them naked and that person being naked. Tickling and wrestling. This can go on right in front of the non-offending parent, because the tickling and wrestling will involve things like tickling and wrestling genitals, but it's real quick and maybe hard to see for the other people in the room. But the message the child gets is, well, that felt weird, but it must be okay because here's my mother sitting right here and she didn't say anything. So it's kind of like giving permission or getting permission to do that sort of touching. Applying medication to a child's genitals. And, you know, if very often I've heard this happen before, and I remember the child saying, I didn't need medication on down there, and if I did, I could do it myself. But sometimes that's just an excuse they use. Examine the child's development. If a parent or an adult is worried about a child's development, the place to take them is the doctor. You don't examine yourself. It's very common to ask children not to tell about the touching. Describing sexual activities with others to children. When you think about that, parents don't want to tell their children, they have a hard time talking to their children about sex and where babies come from, period. And when someone is willing to talk about their own sex life with children, that's odd. At best, that is weird. And same thing with teaching sex education with pornography, because that's usually an excuse. It's not actually what they're doing. They're desensitizing the child to sexual activity with this adult. This is a list of grooming behaviors. It came from it's an old study of incarcerated sex offenders. And they were talking about, these are some of the things that they did in order to get kids to go along with what they were doing and let it accelerate. Okay, so sexual abuse is often traumatic, but not always. So the same event can be experienced and adapted to and carried forward in different ways by different kids. So it's the response to the individual's experience that determines whether or not it's traumatic, not the trauma itself. I remember when I was pretty new to this field, we got an intake at the agency where I used to work, and the child did a forensic interview, which I'll talk about later. I'm not sure if you do them there, but we do them here. And the child had been sexually abused by her father, and she did not seem at all traumatized or upset. For her, it was a game. And her father would put grape jelly on his penis so she could lick it off. And so the interviewer was asking her, well, how this came to be. And I remember the girl saying, no, silly, he put grape jelly on it. My supervisor and I were watching this interview and we were thinking, oh my gosh, when we tell her that was not okay, that's when she'll get traumatized. Not now. Now she thinks this is just a fun game. So it is the response to the event. So actually, you know, and probably later what would happen, because I think she was maybe 8 years old at the time. Later on, when she's 15, 16, 14, and realizes what sex is, then it might hit her and become traumatic. But in the moment when she's 8 and thinks it's a game, it didn't bother her. Okay, somebody has a raised hand. Should I answer that? I don't mind.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, what is the question?
I don't see any question.
Oh, okay, somebody had raised a hand, so I didn't know how to handle that. Now I can't get rid of this screen. Okay. Okay, there's a raised hand. All right. Do you see this no answered questions in the middle of your screen?
No, I don't see. I don't see any.
Okay, so I have to figure out how to, because it's in the middle of mine and it's interfering with what I'm looking at.
Just close it down and keep going.
It says your screen, it's underneath, the close button is underneath something. Oh, let's try that. There we go. All right, that's better. All right, so the incidence rates of child sexual abuse in the US and Canada apparently is falling. And this is from a study that was done. It looks like it's a slightly longitudinal study, but it was published in 2016, so only 4 years ago. There's not a whole lot of new research about child sexual abuse, but this is the newest I could find. But what they found is there is a prevalence of delayed, partial, and non-disclosure in childhood. And that's a persistent trend in withholding child sexual abuse disclosure. So the bottom line is not telling is very common. So the global incidence rate of sexual abuse is 18 to 20% for females, 8 to 10% for males. The highest rates for girls are in Australia, we're at about a little over 21%, and for boys, a little over 19%. And Asia, they don't say where in Asia, have the lowest rates at 4.1 for boys and 11.3 for girls. The authors of the study, though, feel like that the incidence statistics are likely an underestimation of child sexual abuse disclosures. So, but who knows? We'll just go with the numbers they're giving us for now. Okay, so most people, there's a persistence of delayed disclosures, with research showing a large number of survivors only disclosing in adulthood. So they wait until they're older. And that can make sense, because by then it has been bothering you so much and for so long and impacting so much of your life in a negative way that it becomes intolerable. Another possibility is that you are now away from your perpetrator, you're older, you're stronger, your brain perceives that the threat has diminished. And along with that struggle, it's safer to tell. So let's talk about why disclosure is so hard. All right, so from that study, they talked about why men didn't disclose. So in one study, they waited until adulthood to disclose their abuse because of negative stereotypes about men or boys or males who get sexually abused. They talked about breaking their isolation as a motivator for disclosing. In other words, with the aid of various forms of media on disclosure. So in other words, when we talk about it, and especially when we talk about it either on television, through programs, through social media, it lets you, because again, people are social, and it lets that man know you are not the only one. You're not a weirdo. You're not the only person this has happened to. It has happened to other people. It has happened to other males. And so there are people out there who can understand what you've been through and can be helpful. There is a podcast that I have, I've listened to quite a few episodes, but it's called Real Men Feel. And I have the URL down there, but I specifically remember one podcast where there was a man who talked about his sexual abuse disclosure, and he was sexually abused by a family member. And he, at the time he recorded this, it had only been, it had been fewer than 6 months since he had come out and shared with a group of other men that he had been sexually abused, and he hadn't still told several family members, and he was talking about the challenges of that. So, and it became his mission to help other men who have this history to tell and to not keep it quiet anymore. Because he had a lot of, I mean, he struggled a lot in life just trying to cope with the feelings that come from having this knowledge that this happened to you and having it all to yourself. Because again, people are social and this isolates you. It makes you feel alone. And that's a very threatening feeling. Now, this is another study from that same article about why African-American women didn't disclose. And they said that no one's ever talked to them about sex, so they didn't even have the language to disclose. And that's really common. When no one talks to you about sex and what it is and what your body parts are and what they're for, then if a perpetrator tells you this is a game and everybody's doing it and it's okay if I do it, you have no idea that it's not okay and that not everyone is doing it and that they shouldn't be doing it either. You have no idea. So you don't tell. Fear of family breakdown and removal, which is a legitimate fear because it sometimes happens. It happens often enough. Not wanting to tarnish the family's name also happens often enough. Fear of retribution by family members if they disclosed. Because sometimes family members know what's going on and they just tell you to keep it quiet. They will actually do that. I remember one case we were working and it went to court and the child's family, so it was, I believe it was her stepfather. The mother was in support of the stepfather. The siblings were in support of this. The whole family was in support of the stepfather, and they tried their best to make this victim look horrible in court. Fortunately, the jury was on the child's side, and they were very sweet, and they wanted to get together a little fund and help her pay for college when she graduated from high school, because they were very upset, and they told her, don't worry about your family, we're your family now. They were really upset about her family turning their back on her in favor of a perpetrator. So that's not the only time that has happened. And very often the offender will say, you know, no one's going to believe you, they'll believe me. And that's what happens. And they do. That's how it goes down. So that's a very real fear. There's a pattern of stifled and dismissed disclosures identified over the course of a lifetime. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but a lot of times I've seen often enough where a child will say they already told this person, you never told me. Sometimes the language they use is so vague, I can see why the mother believed that the child never told. So this is a small study, and the 17 participants identified spirituality as their primary source of strength throughout life. Primarily because they couldn't trust people, or they had a hard time trusting people, which is understandable given the nature of child sexual abuse and how it happens and by whom. Okay, and so now, so what they've identified, that there are barriers from within. So the victims so often blame themselves. They'll blame themselves for not telling. They'll blame themselves for not fighting back. I remember we used to tell the kids, it's not your fault. He was big and you were little. He was the adult and you were the child and you're supposed to do what he says. And the kids would be like, yeah, but I should have done this and I should have done that. And we would just tell them, no, it's not your fault. And at some point it dawned on me, you know, when you tell a child it's not your fault, you didn't do anything to cause it, he was going to do it no matter what you said, that, you know what else that child heard? Wait a minute, it's not my fault. I didn't do anything to cause it, and there's nothing I could do to stop it. Are you telling me this could happen again? I mean, I could just be a victim and there's nothing I can do. So I had to reframe what I told them. And I said, no, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything to cause it. The only thing you could do to stop it was to tell, but you didn't know that. You didn't know you could tell. You didn't know you could lie to him and say you would not tell and then tell anyway. That would have been okay, but you didn't know. But now you know. So you don't have to be a victim. And you keep telling and telling and telling until somebody believes you and they make the abuse stop. But you didn't know you could tell. That's where your power is, because as soon as somebody, the right person found out, you see where you are, it stopped. Okay, so there are barriers from within. There are barriers in relationship to others. There's violence and dysfunction in the family. I've seen some horrible things that perpetrators are willing to do. You know, do terrible things to pets, do terrible things to siblings in order to keep a victim quiet, do terrible things to the mother. Power dynamics. The kids are aware of the impact of telling, and they may have a fragile, and probably likely have a fragile social network to begin with, which could lose half their family, just like I talked about the girl at court, if they tell. Another thing is a taboo of sexuality. We don't want to tell our children about sex, which actually perpetrators don't mind doing it. So I've kind of jokingly said, if your values about sex are you should never ever have it ever, there's no way to convey that unless you talk to your children about it. So they need to talk to their children about it, whatever your values are on sex. And it's not a one-time, well, let's sit down and talk. It's an ongoing conversation. We'll get more into that later. There's a lack of available services, and a culture or time period in which the abuse occurs can all impact the degree to which someone is comfortable disclosing. Okay. So disclosure is an iterative, interactive process, which means it's not, you don't just sit down and say it once and it's all done. It's best done in the context of a relationship over time. And my observation is that it very often, unless it winds up in an investigation somewhere, it'll go a little bit like this. I actually remember a therapy session where I learned this. There was a mother, actually the mother who had gone to rehab multiple times, and then the child's father sexually abused her during that time. The mom had a hard time believing that her husband would do that, so the child was removed from her home and went to go live with an aunt. We're putting the family back together, so we're doing family therapy. And the daughter, who was probably about 9 or 10, would sit on the sofa next to her mother, and they would talk. And then the daughter had a question, because the daughter was a little angry that her mother didn't protect her, which is not uncommon. So the daughter would get up and move to a chair across the room, ask the question. Her mother would answer, I would answer, the daughter would ponder the answer, and then we'd change subjects and she'd go back and sit next to her mother. And then when she had another important question, she'd get up, move to the chair. After about the third time she moved to the chair, it occurred to me that what she was doing was creating a feeling of safety by creating some physical distance between her and her mother, asking her a question, watching, not just listening for her mother's response, but watching, we'll talk about that, then digesting that response, the physical and the words, what that looked like and what it felt like, and then what does that feel like in her body. And she did the same thing for me. And when she figured out she was safe, she went back and sat next to her mother. It was really interesting. So, but even the disclosure process is very similar, because I've had, and you probably have too, had many victims say, when I say it out loud, it makes it real. And they can imagine that it didn't really happen. Did it really? I wasn't sure, blah, blah. So when you say it out loud though, not only do you hear yourself say it, then you have to deal with what you just said. You have to deal with the idea that someone else heard you and now has their opinion of you changed. And you have to deal with all of that. And so they'll try it. They'll just float a little test, see how you do, see how they, see if it's safe to say a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more until it comes out. Contemporary disclosure reflects a social, ecological, person in environment orientation for understanding the complex interplay. So in other words, it's basically what I'm talking about. The age and gender significantly influence disclosure for a number of reasons. One of the reasons that very small children and children with learning disabilities, children get like intellectually disabled, make great victims because they make terrible witnesses. They have a hard time between distinguishing yesterday, today, and tomorrow. They have a hard time being able to share a story of sexual abuse that makes sense to adults in a court of law. So they, and then there's a lack of life course perspective. Very often young kids just think, I'll just forget about it. It'll go away, I'll forget about it, and I won't have to tell. And that does not work. But they don't know that, they're not mature enough for that. And that's probably, now that I think about it, one of the reasons why they finally tell us as adults, because they realize that they were wrong as children, you need to talk about it. The barriers to disclosure, though, continue to outweigh the facilitators and things that make it easier. And that's from that study. Okay, so children talents, they have often disclosed to several people and they weren't believed or it wasn't reported. Telling all, though, can often be vague and more subtle, like like I was saying, kids will say things like, well, I just don't, he's weird. Uncle so-and-so is just weird. I don't like him. He just does weird stuff. One that I've heard of is, well, my daddy ate my cookie. And that's because, instead of using the right names for genitalia, people will give them nicknames. And so I used to work with a therapist who said, why do, she'd look at the kids and say, what do you call this? Okay, this is a nose. What is this? This is your arm. What are these? These are fingers. Okay, so why do we need nicknames for you? If you have the proper names for these, why do we need nicknames for other body parts like breasts or a penis or a vagina? They're body parts. Why do they need nicknames? We don't have nicknames for our ears, so you don't need nicknames for those either. And if you approach it that way, they're just body parts, that makes the children less vulnerable because they're a little more savvy than the kids that are completely ignorant. Perpetrators don't want to be discovered. So it's not that they just want children. They don't want to be discovered fooling around with children. They will bypass children who are smart, savvy, connected, competent, and go for that. That's why the kids that are the most vulnerable are the most relationally needy and are more willing to put up with whatever the perpetrator wants just for the little crumbs of attention that they get. So obviously a good preventative measure is to be really connected to your kids. Okay, so why else is disclosure so hard? Well, people are afraid. Fear is the bottom line. Sexual abuse and disclosing sexual abuse are intimate, they're personal, they're dysregulating, and very often shame-inducing. And people will do, I'm surprised at how much people are willing to do to avoid feeling bad. Now, they may not feel good, but they won't, at least they won't feel bad. I think a lot of substance abuse is based on trying to avoid feeling really bad. You try to numb it. Okay, let's see. Okay, so very often the story, the personal account of their sexual abuse goes untold, and they just go along with it because they feel helpless and hopeless for anything different. When the people you would ordinarily tell are the people doing it and the people ignoring it, you've learned that you can't trust people because those are the people you should be able to trust. So why would I tell anyone else? People are not trustworthy. Also, perpetrators may make good on their threats. Another, and I'm surprised at how often I've heard this, is that there are older children who will put up with the abuse. So because the perpetrator tells them, well, you know, if you don't let me do this to you, I'll just do it to your younger sister or your younger brother. And so in order to spare that child, they'll put up with it. The problem is very often he's also telling the younger ones the same thing. I'll do your other sister or brother if you don't let me do this. He's getting them all in the house. Another thing they will do to protect younger siblings is, I don't know my dad. My dad left when I was little, before I was born, when I was a baby, and I don't want my siblings to not know their dad. Even though their dad is sexually abusing me, I put up with it so they could at least have a dad, because I know what it's like not to have one. So they feel like they have nowhere else to go. At some point, though, often enough, the abuse gets to be worse, to feel worse than putting up with it. And sometimes that's why kids run away from home and they wind up in human trafficking situations, just trying to get away from being abused at home. In fact, it happens often enough to where in Texas, and probably other states too, but certainly in Texas, we have, and in the Houston area, we have something called girls' court. And so when child prostitutes get arrested for prostitution, a lot of these kids are runaways from homes where they were getting sexually abused. And so rather than treating them just as criminals, we treat them as the victimized kids that they are, and work with, they get more therapy, they a lot more supports, just trying to get them to a place where, hey, they don't have to do that anymore, don't depend on their pimps, and stop getting abused at home. Okay, so child sexual abuse, grooming, and disclosing are processes that occur over time. But sometimes, even without words, children will tell with their behavior. I do remember one time there was a boy who had been sexually abused. He and his sister had been sexually abused, and the mother went to prison, or to jail. She was in jail. And it wasn't just sexual abuse. There were all kinds of crazy things going on in their house. And because the mother was First Nations, she was Native American, and they have a separate set of rules here. So when she got out, those kids were going to go back and live with her. Well, they didn't really want to, but they were afraid to say that. So they were having phone calls, visits, and maybe even sessions with they had 1 or 2 sessions with their mother. And the boy, the more sessions he had, the more contact he had with his mother, the worse and worse he got, because she kept saying, we're going to be a family, and some guy that she'd been with before she went to prison was going to move back in. And eventually his placement foster home broke down because his behavior was so bad, because what he really meant was he wanted to live with his mother and his dad, not his mother and this other guy. But while he said he wanted to live with his mom, his behavior said something completely different, to the point where he lost his placement. So some of the behaviors are, the true red flags are when they tell you they've been sexually abused, because kids rarely make this up. It's too embarrassing. You might make up a lot of other things, but this you rarely make up. And in this country, the research says that when kids do make it up, it's usually because there's one parent that said, you have to tell people this, and it's usually because of a messy divorce. And so one parent is retaliating against the other, or it's a teenager that got caught with having sex with someone she should not have. So, but usually you get a younger child who says they've been sexually abused. They have specifically sexual symptoms, physical symptoms, running away from home, like I just talked about, and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Those are your clues that sexual abuse is probably what happened. So some of the sexual symptoms are public masturbation. I mean, everywhere, in place, just during situations and times when it would be really weird to be doing it. Kids whose play includes putting items in their own vagina or rectum, sexual acting out with animals, poking objects into animals' rectums, sexual acting out with stuffed animals, sexual acting out with other children. And I don't mean just playing doctor. I'll show you mine, you show me yours. It's inserting things and touching genitalia. Sexual acting out toward adults, extreme fear of having their genitals exposed during bathing, showering, diapering, toileting. And I remember working with an adult woman who, one of the reasons she knew that she had been sexually abused is through her adoptive mother, who said it was very difficult to change that child's diaper, her diaper, because of the just extreme terror she showed when her diaper was removed. And then the woman had some other symptoms too, but that was one of them. Others of possible sexual abuse. Now, these might be sexual abuse symptoms, but they might not be. Pain when using the toilet. It could also just be constipation, which requires laxative. But genital infections, well, that's more clear. Cuts or bruising in the genital area. Suddenly sleeping in all of their clothes because they're hoping to make it more difficult for a perpetrator to get to their genitalia. They begin wetting the bed again when they've been sleeping dry through the night. Appetite changes, masturbating a lot, frequent sexual play with friends, toys, or pets, unexplained periods of panic, waking up with night terrors. Some of these, like the night terrors and the panic, wetting the bed, appetite changes, those tend to be child trauma symptoms, and they could be related to anything: bullying at school, having lived through some sort of, I don't know, community violence, whatever. It could be any of that, but it could be sexual abuse too. It just bears looking into. Physical symptoms: red or swollen genitalia, which is abnormal. Blood in the child's underwear, unless it's a menstruating girl, that's abnormal. Repeated fissures in the anus, abnormal. Tears in the vagina, constant rashes in the vaginal area past diaper age, complaints of genitals hurting or itching, bruising in upper thighs or vaginal area, hickeys anywhere on the body of a young child, vaginal discharges, pregnancy in a child that should not be having sex. Okay, sexual abuse is often experienced as a trauma, the effects of which can be seen through behavior. So I remember we were talking about lying earlier. What should we do about the lying? We'll figure out why they're lying, because very often, you know, people lie. I've had attorneys ask me, well, don't kids lie? I was like, well, of course they do, but people lie. And people lie for a reason. And so once you figure out why they're lying and you address that, the lying should go away. The same thing with stealing and hoarding, although I do find that often also goes along with having been neglected, because they never know when they're going to get what they need again. So while it's available, they're taking advantage. They don't seem to hear or listen, which is probably related to dissociation. They don't seem to learn from past mistakes or consequences, probably related to being dysregulated. Often, problems with eating, sleeping, or breathing, or breathing, poor grades in school, poor social skills, including aggression and labile emotions, which are linked to childhood depression, which is a little bit different than adult depression. It manifests a little bit differently. It's being deliberately mean or hurtful to others. This is really a lot more common than I would have thought. But people who can't get close enough to you because you are too mean or hurtful, they can't hurt you because they can't get close enough. The child may seem psychotic. And sometimes they're not necessarily schizophrenic, but they can have PTSD or depression or some other psychosocial mental problem with psychotic features, which could possibly be actually more like a dissociative identity disorder rather than psychosis. But it could be psychotic features. They avoid anything that triggers strong negative feelings because they can't tolerate them. They may engage in self-injurious behavior, including significant risk-taking. I remember going to a workshop many years ago, and the vendor was talking about people who engage in self-injurious behavior. And they said, if you have 100 of those people in a room, 50 of them have likely been sexually abused. So it is that big of a symptom that you ought to at least look into it. And it tends to pop up around age 12 or 13, but it may not be necessarily sexual abuse, but some form of abuse or neglect. Self-mutilation is not that uncommon. Okay, so other symptomatic behavior: defiance, just refusing to do it, checking out, like you're not there, not paying attention, or being overly compliant. Problems with transitions, unpredictability, and unplanned changes. They need things consistent because they need to know what to expect, and that's so that they know how to respond and protect themselves. Persistent, recurrent tantrums, rocking, head banging, and other repetitive self-soothing behaviors, because those rocking, head banging behaviors are self-soothing and they help that child calm down. Seem unwilling to verbalize thoughts or feelings or answer questions. And I don't think it's because they can't, because they don't want to, it's because they can't. All right, I think the next slide will explain that. No, but we will later. Okay, other symptoms of trauma include attachment problems, and poor self-perspective, negative self-image, self-deprecating, body image problems, etc. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the brain here. And I'm sure Dr. Perry showed you at least the slide on the left more than once. Your brain is arranged in a hierarchical fashion from the bottom to the top and from the inside out. So that's how it develops and organizes and actually functions. And so it is interconnected. Those different areas communicate with one another through various, what we call axonal projections. And there is a, you know, when we do, because we'll do assessments and we'll look at various parts of the brain and how they're functioning, but really we're looking at networks because these regions are connected. And if you impact one, it impacts the others. So at the bottom is your brainstem and cerebellum, and that's where your autonomic nervous system stuff goes on. So those are the things you don't have to worry about. You can go to sleep and not think about or try to make your heart beat or keep your blood pressure where it needs to be or keep your body temperature up. That your body takes care, your brain takes care of that for you. Up at the top, those are the things you can control. Down at the bottom, it's much tougher to control because of what it does. So the other thing to keep in mind, though, is that when you get more upset or dysregulated, your brain starts to shut down and function less efficiently from the top down. At the top of your brain, in the cortex, you have your speech and language areas. So that what that means is, for disclosure, when someone asks you about an event like that one, which is shame, anxiety provoking, your brain perceives that as threatening. Just talking about it, sharing it with someone else is a threat to the self and to connection with other people. And so that top part of your brain functions less efficiently. And so talking about it is difficult. The words just simply don't come out well. And hearing other people talk about it doesn't work out well. That is why when some people, when they have to give a big speech, they're a nervous wreck And it's so hard to give the speech because the part of the brain that you need to give the speech isn't working very well. When you have an argument with someone, a very heated argument with someone who's important to you, and you are so irritated by what, and there's a lot of back and forth, and you finally go, you know what, forget it. And later when you're calm, you think of all the things you could have said. You didn't think of them then because that perceived threat of being disconnected from that person, feeling disconnected from that person, was so threatening that it felt like an attack on the self, and a threat to your survival, to the lower part of your brain that's also where this information is going in, that it started a cascade of responses, one of which is to shut down the part of the brain that would interfere with your survival and move closer to survival mode. And so you couldn't say what you wanted to say. And later when you're calm, when you feel safer, now you can think of all that stuff. So it's basically and depending on how threatening what is happening is, there's a pre-cortical association. And so before you even have a chance to think about it, you've responded. So before you have a chance to really give it a good thought about why you should or shouldn't tell, the lower part of your brain has decided, we're not telling, that's too dangerous. And so nothing comes out. And the story is not shared. Okay, I normally, when I do this talk about just communicating and how difficult it is, because a lot of times people will say, well, those kids, or those clients, it's not those people, it's all of us. I do this little, but it's not going to work here in a virtual environment. But I do it's a Dan Siegel exercise. It's about the mind-body connection and what that physically feels like when you feel threatened, because we don't pay attention to it, but it is there. So what I'm going to do, though, is I hope you can hear this video. But I want you to see how, and you may have already, this is probably why adults tell eventually. The shame is so implicit in sexual abuse, it makes it hard to talk about. And if you're concerned with how you appear to other people, to the degree that you don't want to risk your relationship with them or your connection with them, it makes it easier to keep things to yourself. Let me know if you cannot hear this. I hope that you can.
No, we cannot hear it.
You can't? Okay, hang on. All right, so then, shoot, we're gonna have to skip that then, because I'm not sure how to get that video to play to where you can hear it. Okay, let's move on. There's a woman what she does is she's talking about her experience at a music camp. And I don't think I can fast forward it. This is the woman. She's talking about her experience at a music camp when she was a teenager and her parents were there, and she met this boy and they were making out and they got caught. And there was so much shame involved in getting caught. She wouldn't go to the cafeteria and eat. There she is, upset again. And she was surprised because she thought she could just talk about it, and matter of factly, because it happened so long ago. But you can see right there, she's still so worked up and torn up about it that it's a struggle to talk about. So now, that wasn't even sexual abuse. That was just an incident she found shame-provoking. So imagine when it's sexual abuse and you think it's your fault. Okay. All right, so The other thing about people who have an abuse or neglect history is because the brain is a survival organ, and because the brain is constantly making sure that you are safe and scanning the environment for anything threatening and preparing to respond to that, and one of the things that's very, very threatening, because humans are social, is disconnection. So, but people with an abuse history overread social cues because they become sensitized to anything that appears threatening in any way that is somewhat similar to what was threatening in their past. So when, and it also impacts their attachment style. So they will figure that if it's something benign that should be benign, they're already thinking, oh, they don't like me. I forget the person's research, but they had people with abuse history and then control groups look at pictures of faces. And the people with the abuse history saw neutral faces as angry. And they had a hard time distinguishing between sad faces, fearful faces, and angry faces. They all looked angry to them. That's because they overread that social cue and skew it toward the negative and then make it personal. They don't like me. They hate me. It's a matter of time before they ask me to move. And this is just, we just need to talk. And it's just a benign conversation. But, you know, sometimes there are husbands or men who are in relationships with some, let's say, very excitable women who, when the woman says, we need to talk, he already knows it's going to be a fight. Well, just magnify that many times over. And that anxiety that comes up, and that's kind of where these folks are. Okay, so what happens though is because they move along, I'm sure Dr. Perry showed you the arousal continuum too. So so when you are calm, you tend to be more inwardly focused, but you get to be creative. You have access to all parts of your brain. And you have access to your neocortex, so you can be really creative. You can problem solve. You can, and then your cortex. As you become more alert, now you're more outwardly focused, and you're more relationally connected to other people. This is the area where we will do what is called flocking. So it's the first area of, wait, did you guys see that too? I've seen experiments where somebody goes in a waiting room and there's some weird sound that sounds, and the other people in the waiting room just stand up. And so the person who's new to the waiting room doesn't understand why everybody's standing up. And then they just sit down, and then it happens several more times. So finally he starts standing up too. And then the people go back. And then when the new person comes, now he's alone in the waiting room, and the sound comes on and he stands up and he sits down. Then a new person comes in and the sound comes on and he stands up and he sits. He's been conditioned to go along with the group, even though the group is not there. So they'll move along to compliance. Didn't know why, but it was weird and got his attention. So, you know, that's if you're on there's two continuums here, and they can sometimes operate together. The dissociative continuum, where you kind of check out, and the hyperarousal continuum, where you fight, flee. And this is freeze, or the dissociative is freeze or faint. And sometimes they operate together as you try to figure out what should I do to keep myself safe, to stay out of trouble. Okay. Again, part of what we're doing, you know, as you move along the arousal continuum, part of what you're doing, whether you recognize it or not, is responding to feeling your feelings. We didn't really get a chance to do the Dan Siegel exercise, but most people are not aware of this, but your body feels very, very different when you're anxious or nervous or scared than it does when you're calm and relaxed and happy. And if you can think of some times where you felt very frightened you got some really, really bad news. I'm having trouble thinking of some really good examples. You had to testify in court, for example, unless you're an attorney and you really like that sort of thing. The anxiety that comes up comes with some physical sensations. And I have but I have noticed that people respond. That's really what most people are responding to, I believe, is those physical sensations that they don't want. They're very uncomfortable, and they will do whatever is necessary to get rid of those. So if it means wiggling, if it means fighting, if it means checking out so you don't feel them, they will do that. So because those are really challenging to deal with. The other thing that happens, though, when you are dysregulated, your functional IQ goes down, because the part of your brain that helps enhance that is more and more offline and functioning less and less efficiently. So you make poorer decisions, like deciding not to tell, for example, might be one, even though it could change the trajectory of your life for the better. And you should tell. You don't tell. Okay. And I don't know how aware you guys are of the adverse childhood experiences study that was actually quite an accident, that they discovered this collection of childhood events that occurred that then later in adulthood impact your physical health, never mind your emotional and mental health, but your physical health. Like you're more likely to have cancer or diabetes or heart disease or any number of things with lots of early adversity, except that it depends on when that adversity occurs. It depends on who's around and who's helpful. So healthy relationships early in life will help mitigate those. So you can have up to 4 adverse childhood experiences without the ill effects of them if you have healthy attachments and healthy relationships. That's how important relationships are. That's because that's how social people are. We need other people. And we need connection with other people. So it is a better of your health, your physical health and your emotional health, than anything that has happened to you. It is your connections. That is what makes the difference. In fact, there's old and recent research that shows that even with therapy, it's not the technique. It's the relationship that you develop. It's the therapeutic relationship that you and the client develop together that heals. It's not the technique. I know in this country, there's a big push toward trauma-focused care, trauma-sensitive care, and there are different models of treatment. So people will get trained in, say, TB, trust-based relational interaction. They'll get trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and they'll say, I'm a trauma therapist, I know this model. They get trained in EMDR. And that's fine, but what that really tells you is you're trauma aware and you know how to implement this model. It doesn't necessarily make you trauma informed. Trauma informed lets you know when you should not be using that model or which pieces of that model will not be helpful because you're attuned to the client. So in my personal view, the moment you forget about the client and focus on your model, you're not trauma informed anymore. You stay focused on that client and everything, then you'll know what to do. You'll know, and especially if you understand how brains work and how people function, and you're focused on people and your relationship, you'll have a better idea of, don't use this, use this. You can use this model, but not these pieces, use this instead. Because really everybody's different and there is no one size fits all treatment to anything. Okay. Now, another thing, you know, one of the articles that it was the research on why African-American women didn't tell. part of it is they had no language for it. They never talked about sex. No one ever talked about it with them, and they had no language for it. Well, this book has a language for it, and it's for children. And a friend of mine who's a psychologist, many, many years ago when my daughter was little, over 20 years ago, bought this book for us. She also bought it for the agency where we were working, but she bought one for me. And my daughter and I, my daughter was 6 at the time, and so she read a page to me and I read a page to her. And I did it that way so that we could start a conversation about sex, and she knew it was okay to talk about it with me where nobody was freaking out and nobody was anxious and nervous. We're just reading a book. At the end of the book, I told her, you know what, if you have more questions about this, we can talk about it at any time. It's not a big deal. Please don't tell your friends. Their parents want to tell them. Their parents didn't want to tell them. I just didn't want, messages from school. Your daughter's talking about sex at school. But I told her, we can talk about this anytime. It's not that much different than what happens to your food after you eat it. And she said, well, what does happen to your food after you eat it? So then we talked about digestion and poop. But really, that's kind of how kids see it. When I was a kid, my mother told my sister and me about sex, and I was probably 7 or 8. My sister was a year and a half younger. She was a registered nurse, so she used all the right words. And she ended her talk with, and that's why people get married. And my sister and I looked at each other and went, oh God, why would you get married for that? We have since figured it out, but in the moment, we didn't think about sex like, oh, I should try that, which is what most adults fear, is that, oh, kids are thinking, well, I should try that. No, kids are thinking it's gross. And kids are thinking, good God, I hope you don't do that. Did you, Mom? So it's okay to tell them. It's okay to tell them, because if you don't, you know what? There are people out there who are willing to do it, and they may not share your values. And in fact, they may do it with touching. And so rather than have that go down, you want your kids armed and educated. And along with that, I also told her it is okay to tell adults no to some things, because there's some things they shouldn't be asking you to do. Keeping secrets from me, touching, none of that. Actually, the psychologist that gave me this book, she told her sons, if I ever touch you in a way that you don't like, you tell me. And so her first son said, well, I don't want hugs. She was crestfallen, but she had to respect that. When my daughter was little, and I had told her the same thing, and then we would tickle, and she'd say, okay, Mom, that's enough. And if I gave her one more tickle, she said, Mom, you said that if and I, yes, you're right, I'm sorry, you're right. I couldn't do one more. So you have to respect that. Telling kids to kiss or hug Uncle so-and-so or Aunt whatever her name is, or you meet a friend on the street, well, give them a hug. Stop doing that. Don't do that. That tells a child that they don't get to decide what happens to their body. Adults do. We don't want that. Children should get to decide within limits. I mean, if you go to the doctor and he has to touch, he has to touch, but there's usually another adult there to make sure the touching is appropriate and necessary. Okay, so along with this is, because if you didn't hear anything else today, humans are social, we need other people, and talking about this, disclosing this, preventing this occurs in relationship and over time. And one way to keep your kids safe, and one way to get them to a place where they are safe, is because they can then tell and get that abuse to stop, is to create a space where it feels safer to tell than it does to keep it quiet. So being present, being nearby, being patient and persistent, and being just predictable and positive will help anybody, not just children, but adults, feel like, well, maybe I can trust you. Maybe I can tell you this. Maybe it'll be okay if I tell you. Maybe I'll still be safe. Okay, here's another video that we probably can't hear or read. But anyway, this is about social referencing. I'm just gonna at least get to the pictures if I can. Get it started. Okay. So what this is about is social referencing. And it's,
Diane, I think you have to share the sound of your computer.
oh, okay. Let me see. How would I do that?
In the microphone, in the little arrow.
Okay, same built-in micro, same as system output. Huh. Do you know which one of these it is? Is it same? I'm using a Bose sound link right now. So would it be built-in microphone?
Let's try audio settings. In the bottom.
Okay. Did you hear that?
No.
Do you hear that sound?
No.
No. Okay.
It says in your computer says automatically join audio by computer when joining a screen.
You want to try that?
Yes.
Let's see if I can find that. Join audio, mute microphone when joining, press. Okay, where would I find that? Audio.
In audio settings.
Okay. Test microphone, out microphone.
No.
Okay.
Lower it says automatically join audio by computer.
Diane,
Huh?
in the top of your screen, you have view options. You see your
Okay, hang on.
view options and share computer sound.
I'm in speaker mode, which is the problem. Okay, let me get out of.
In the top of your screen, you have to share computer, share screen. Sorry.
At the top of my.
But you have to share first.
Okay, share screen.
Share screen.
Okay.
Then in the top of your screen, you have view options.
No, see, that's the problem. Well, let me, I don't. I have mute, stop video, participants, Q&A, new share, pause share, annotations, remote control.
You have an arrow there. Click on
chat, record on this, disable and hide video, hide copies. No. Okay. Okay, so I gave Abram control. Do you see it?
Abraham, ¿me oyes? No,
Okay,
no lo vamos a poder hacer nosotros, solo ella lo puede hacer porque nosotros no podemos ver sus opciones de Zoom. Ok. Ajá. Okay. Diane, can you hear me?
Yes.
When you click on share screen, first you have to select the option of audio, share audio.
When I share my screen,
Put your screen. Ok. Déjame, a ver un segundo. A ver, Abraham.
Sí, que
Ya le
ponga
puedo.
share screen. Diane, you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so you have to share screen, put share screen, but before you put share, then you'll find on the left corner on the bottom.
On the bottom.
You see a place that you can put a
share computer sound.
Yeah, that's it. You put it. And now
Okay.
share. Now you can share, and that's it. Now we can hear.
Oh my goodness! It wants me to restart my video. Audio.
Okay, that's it.
Oh shoot! I wonder what password I should be entering to share your. Please install the Zoom audio device. I need this. Please restart your audio sharing application, such as media. Oh, that's going to be a big mess. So what it's saying is to share your computer audio, please install the Zoom audio device. Please restart your audio sharing application, such as the media player after installation to continue to sharing computer sound.
Yeah, so do it. No problem with that.
Really? Okay. Let me see if I can remember the password.
That's it. So now you put play and we can hear
Did I
it.
do it? Okay, let's try.
Of the baby towards the parent
we can hear
and
it.
the parent.
So start from the beginning.
Emotion is a nonverbal language.
Did you tell me to go?
Emotions reveal the cognition, the understanding of the baby. And furthermore, emotions are the nonverbal communication of the baby towards the parent and the parent towards the baby. Therefore, I thought that emotions were a royal road, one royal road, to the study of the baby's development.
In this study, babies between 9 and 12 months are brought into the lab and placed on a large plexiglass top table. Half of the table has a checkerboard pattern just underneath the surface, but halfway across is a visual cliff, which the baby can tell drops off steeply. The plexiglass top continues, so it's perfectly fine to proceed. But the baby isn't so sure, and this is a big drop for a baby just starting to crawl. She wants to get across to get the toy, but she's cautious and looks to the opposite end of the table where her mother is. The parent is instructed to smile or make a fear face.
If the mother is posing a fear face, the baby typically does not cross this stair-step downward, this modified visual cliff or visual step. On the other hand, if the mother poses a smile or somehow poses a nonverbal communication that is not prohibitive but encouraging, the child is much more likely to cross over to her. This particular study demonstrates the role of nonverbal communication in determining the child's behavior in uncertain contexts. A baby will, when they encounter something ambiguous, something uncertain, will typically look to the significant other, the mother, the father, a grandparent, the caregiver, in order to figure out what to do. So by 11 to 12 months of age, the baby is already doing what all of us do when something unusual happens. We look around to figure out how other people are reacting.
Okay, so now that's just should I do this or not, but that's also should I tell or not. And so they're looking at you. You know, when you go to therapy school and they tell you you got to watch your face, that's why. Now, I happen to know that I have a very expressive face. And so for me, I the other thing is I have a lot of respect for my clients, a lot, because I know how hard this is. And so it is an honor when I finally get someone to share their trauma history with me. So they can probably pick that up though, because of how I feel and because my face is expressive. When I'm not sure they're picking up what they should be picking up, I tell them, I verbally tell them so that they can match what I'm saying with what I look like as we develop a relationship together and as we get to know one another, so that they are more comfortable telling me things. And because they know that I'm being empathic is the bottom line. But those babies were looking to their mother to find out if they should cross. But imagine when the feedback you've gotten as a baby is, you know what, don't tell it, don't say it. And then you look at other people, you're using those tools to decide whether or not to communicate with other people and how. So, you know, when it occurs as early, that skill develops as early as an infant, we're still using it. It doesn't go away. It's not just something for babies. It's something for people. So we as clinicians, as parents, we have to be attuned to our children. We have to be attuned to ourselves. So we have to be aware of what our face is saying. We have to be aware of what our body's feeling. Because even if you're not aware of what your face is saying, you can feel your body if you pay attention. If you don't pay attention, you may not. Whatever it is you're feeling will come up on your face. And what may very well be coming up on your face is, don't tell me anymore. Okay, and they'll pick that up. And then they'll stop talking. And then you don't get the disclosure you want. So effective relational interactions, they require your attunement. And so that's why it's so important. Really, it is important. I really feel like people shouldn't even be able to drop out of school without at least understanding child development. But really, we need so much more, because we make so many terrible policy decisions and mistakes just because we don't understand people. Okay. So now, related to that, in therapy school, one of the things they tell you to watch your face, and so you try not to have any reaction. That's almost as bad as having too big a reaction. Here's this one.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing?
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Okay, so, you know, one of the other couple of other things I got from that is, you know, when that baby was in distress and there was no reaction from the mother, if you're an older person, and this is someone that you don't really know, that this is your therapist, this is your teacher, you just stop talking. You would just stop talking too. Because what you would be getting back from them is, I'm not enjoying this conversation that I'm having with you. But this baby wanted to be, again, in connection with their mom, and they were losing it. So all those behaviors were designed to regain connection. So the behavior was bigger, it was louder, and that's what people do when they want to, when they're trying to make a point and you're not getting it, they'll say it bigger, louder, because that's why it's important to hear people. Even if you don't agree, just hear them, say you've heard them, and then they can calm down a little bit. The thing is, when you're calm, you can talk more. If you're not calm, it's very difficult to communicate verbally. Because again, your speech and language areas are up at the top. Your brain starts to function less efficiently from the top down. So using those speech and language areas in a location that's not functioning well is difficult. So Dr. Perry may have shown you this slide too. What we tend to try to do is to regulate, relate, and then reason. So regulating is, look, you're not in trouble. I still like you. I'm just trying to understand, and then relate. If they finally tell you anything, then you can express empathy, for example. But while this regulating is going on, they're taking in the information from the outside world, which is impacting how the body feels. They're paying attention to how that body feels, and that information is telling them whether or not they're safe. If they feel unsafe, you need to go back and regulate them again. Then you can relate, and then you can reason, then you can talk, and you can reflect, and you do more therapy. But so when I learned this, one of the things I wound up doing is putting, because one way to regulate is not only with verbal reassurances, but also somatosensory regulation. So anything that's pattern, repetitive, rhythmic, sensory, motor. Sometimes I'll tell people just, okay, you can stop talking. I have a rocking chair in my office. And I have gotten people to move. I can see they're getting dysregulated. I've gotten them to move from the sofa to the rocking chair and just rock, don't talk, just rock. And then I have to use my facial expression, which is one of acceptance and one of, you have control over this. You get to decide whether or not you tell me anything, and you don't have to tell me anything. When I have new clients that come in, especially when they're kids, I will tell them, look, at some point, one of the things I want you to know is that I ask a lot of questions, and it's because I want to understand you. And at some point you're going to think I'm really stupid because I ask what seems like a stupid question, lots of stupid questions, like, what do you mean by friend, when you'll use the term friend? And some people have, hundreds of Facebook friends, most of whom they've never met. Okay, that's your definition, but I don't know that, because my definition is much more, you got to do a whole lot more to be a friend to me. So I'm interested in your definition. That's why I ask, because I'm interested in you. So later, when I ask a question, here's another thing. You get to control and decide how much you say in here, because you couldn't control the sexual abuse. That happened to you whether you wanted it to or not. I'm not going to replicate that dynamic in here. In here, you get to decide if you tell me or not, or when, or how fast, or how slow, or whatever. So if I ask you a question, any question, and you're thinking, what? I don't know what you mean. then you say, do you know what you say? And I don't know. I say, what? I don't know what you mean. And then I'll repeat myself and I'll use different language. And if then you understand me and you think, I'm not telling her that. Do you know what you tell me? No. I say, I'm not telling you that. That's fine. We'll talk about something else. I will ask you another day though. And then if you're thinking to yourself, I thought I already told her, I'm not saying anything about that. Do you know what you tell me? No. You say, I thought I already told you. I'm not telling you anything about that, which is fine. We won't talk about it. At some point, I'll ask again. At some point, I'm going to ask you why you don't want to talk about it. You still don't have to talk about it, but I'm going to want to know why. And that, you know, but they usually laugh about that. And the ironic thing is they wind up telling me. Sooner or later, they wind up telling me what I'm asking. Even if their body language, and sometimes it's a little tricky because their body language says they're very uncomfortable with the question. And I know my face. So I will just say, well, let me tell you why I'm asking. I remember recently, and it wasn't about sexual abuse, it was about some other thing the kid was embarrassed about. And maybe it was wetting the bed or something. And his sister outed him. Yeah, well, he wets the bed or whatever it is he does. And he said, I didn't want to tell her that. And I said, why? Because I said, are you embarrassed? Are you worried about what I'm going to think? Yes. Oh, well, let me tell you what I think. And I was thinking all these wonderful things. And so then he told me more stuff. So, you know, part of doing therapy and getting a disclosure and listening to the and responding in the moment to what you're hearing so that they will keep going is to listen with your eyes. That is so important, to listen with your eyes as well as your ears, and then listen with your heart. But, you know, and by that I mean, if I were this 10-year-old telling this story to this grown-up, when a grown-up has hurt them, wow, where would I be? What would I be thinking and feeling? How safe would I feel? And so everything you do in that session and in that moment should be designed to help them know that this is safe and that not every adult is like that. And it's like this, like the perpetrator, and I'm different. And I want you to enjoy a different experience of connecting with an adult, being safe and nurturing and protecting. So I give kids permission not to tell. I'll say things like, I know they know. I'll say, well, if you remember later. So I don't want to make them out to be a liar. It's just, if you remember later, just let me know. If something comes up later, that's fine. Because then that gives them permission to share when they're ready. If I'm asking about emotions, you know, they're already a little dysregulated by having to share in the first place. So I'll say, some kids, especially since I can probably guess what they're feeling just by their body language and facial expression. So I'll say something like, well, you know, some kids feel embarrassed and some kids feel this. And then it's A, recognition, easier than recall, and B, wait, I'm not a weirdo. I'm not alone. Other people feel this too. So they get connection through other kids. I'm serving as proxy, but it makes it so that A, I'm familiar with this. B, I didn't think those kids were weird. And so if that's what you're feeling, you're not weird either. So all of that lends itself to staying safe while you disclose and not losing connection. Okay, now I don't know about where you guys are in the United States. We have what we call child advocacy centers, and they are basically headed up and run by, overseen by the National Child Advocacy Center in Alabama. And they have a process for interviewing kids. You know, for most of us, making a sexual abuse disclosure is an iterative relational process that takes place over time rather than a discrete event. But this makes it a discrete event. So there's a protocol, and it's a protocol that will stand up in court so that no one can accuse the victim of having been coached. So the interviewer will ask some icebreaker questions about school and family member, you know, who do you live with, and pets and whatever. And then they ask them, and it also gets the child used to talking and the feeling that this is a safe conversation. Then they ask the child if they know the difference between a truth and a lie. And then they give them examples. So like this interview may ask the child, okay, so if I said your shirt was purple and green, would that be a truth or a lie? And then the child would say, well, it's a lie. And you'd say, well, why is it a lie? He said, because it's not true. My shirt is not purple and green. And she said, okay, so if I said your shirt was red and white striped, would that be the truth or a lie? It's a truth. Why is it the truth? Because my shirt is red and white. Okay, so today, let's promise to only say true things in here, things that really happened. And then they start asking about the abuse. They'll ask for clarification. They'll ask for more detail. They try to keep a relatively neutral, pleasant face, neutral, pleasant tone of voice. There are two people who are either watching via camera or through a two-way mirror, and it's usually a police officer and maybe some other invested parties, usually the caseworker. And then when the interviewer has asked all the questions they can think of, they'll excuse themselves. They'll come talk to these two people who are watching and find out what other questions they want answered, because they've now established a relationship with this child. If these two people were to ask, the kid has to start all over. They don't know these two people, blah, blah, blah. So it gets everybody's questions answered once so that the child doesn't have to tell their story over and over and over again. And then they thank the child for telling, and they remind the child that you did nothing wrong and you were brave to tell, and now we're going to do what we can to make it stop. So, and I know they do have training protocols that people can attend. They're all, obviously, thanks to COVID, all virtual now. They used to do them live. Okay, so we're going to move into some prevention tips for keeping your children safe. So, familiarize, know where your kids are going, and familiarize yourself with the policies and practices of organizations where your children spend time. So, background checks. Are you doing background checks? Do you allow adults to be alone with, one adult alone with children? That sort of thing. Can I pop a daycare center? Can I pop in anytime? Are there cameras around? Because some daycares have cameras where parents can check it with their children at any time by just logging on. Ensure that there are policies in place that prohibit situations where adults can be alone with your child in one room when no one else is around to monitor. Make sure they actually follow them. Talk to your child. And this is talk to, I would say talk with. It should be an ongoing conversation back and forth where they talk, you listen, you talk, they listen. I know when my daughter was growing up, there was nothing, absolutely nothing in this house that we could not say to one another. In other words, there's no such, parents are very often saying things like, oh, you shouldn't say that. Okay, that gives your child the message that there's some things I cannot talk about. I want my kid to be able to tell me anything. So that is not verbiage I ever use, so you shouldn't say that. Now, what I did say was, well, if you say that outside the house, these are some things that can happen. And they're not also necessarily things you want to happen. But in here, it's all fine. So because I made any topic of conversation okay in the house, I know when she was 11, she went to, it was a day camp, and two little boys were laughing and joking. She was 11. And they used the word porn, and she didn't know what that meant. So she asked them, well, what does porn mean? And they wouldn't tell her. And she said, no, it's all right. I'll just ask my mom. And they both went, no, don't ask your mother. And she said, oh, it's all right. She won't care. So I pick her up. I'm in the car. She asked me what porn is. And I'm thinking, what did y'all do today? So I told her, well, about like this. I said, well, it's when people take pictures or movies of people doing sexual things. Why are you asking? So she told me this story, and I thought, oh, thank God. We had this conversation early and often, and she knew it was okay to ask me, because when we had those early conversations, that's what I wanted to happen. I wanted her to feel okay asking me stuff like that, because it could have just as easily been a 40-year-old man that used that term and started stuff. And I wanted her to be able to come to me and say, hey, what is this? Okay, so you start early. It's never too early. to listen to your children and to talk to your children, because when you're listening with your eyes and your ears and you're not just hearing the words, you're paying attention to what their physical presentation is telling you. So listen with both. Use everyday situations as teachable moments so that you can keep these things going. Yeah, and yeah, the sexual conversation about sex and sexual abuse, it's more than one conversation. Watch for changes in your child's behavior, because it may not be sexual abuse. It may be they're getting bullied at school. It may be, who knows what else. But just pay attention and then check in with your kids. Notice their behavior before and after they spend time with anybody really, but certainly certain adults. Educate yourself, educate your community. The reason why we still have this issue is because people are afraid to talk about it. It allows it to happen and to continue and to get worse. Parents are our greatest resource. Because they're with their children the most, and because they establish how kids experience relationships. Keep learning and talk openly with your neighbors and friends and family, and organizations to keep your children safe. And look out for other people's kids. Okay, oh my goodness. I think that's it. What time is it? I don't even know. Oops, we're out of time, aren't we? Well over. 12 to 1:30. Oh, I'm well over time. I'm sorry about that.
Don't worry, Diane. We have
Okay.
some questions.
Okay.
It says, if so much of today's therapy is done via Zoom and most healing occurs within the social engagement interaction, what tips do you have to remediate that?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I hate doing therapy online. I mean, I really hate it, because I use everything I'm seeing to do this. So what I would recommend though is pay attention to what you can see, and just comment on that. It's kind of like when you do play therapy. I start off with child-centered non-directive, and sometimes one of the techniques in play therapy is to comment on how the toys might feel. So you can comment on, if empathy will allow you to look at somebody's facial expression and go, I know that's an awkward question, I'm sorry, or that looks like it might be upsetting, do I have that right? You can explain your own face to people. It's like, well, I'm sure my face is whatever, but I'm concerned. This is why I'm concerned. Be sure to let people know that you like and respect them, even when they tell you difficult things. And that if you have this frowny face when they tell you something awful, it's because you feel it's like, that must have been really difficult. That must have been really frightening for you, that sort of thing. So you have to find different ways to connect. I cannot wait until we're all back in the office and we can actually see people. Also, if you see somebody getting really, really upset, then you just back off. And then you say, I'm wondering, it appears that you're getting, and maybe if I'm pushing too fast, I want to stop. So I'm going to back up and make it, because I don't want to overwhelm you. And I'll literally tell them, look, you couldn't control the abuse. I don't want this to be a replication of that.
Okay. The last question, Diane, is sometimes the child is so confused if she loves or hates the perpetrator, if he is a close relative or family friend, and can feel it is not right to tell on him because of this feeling. How do you work with these confusing feelings?
Oh, most people have that feeling. It's like, because he's not just a bad guy. He's the guy that, he's the guy that where other people won't take the time to connect with you, he will. So that's not, and it's just that he's got, first of all, I give them permission to feel what they feel. That's the very first thing. it is okay to love this person, because it is. It's okay to love this person. They don't do this 24/7. They're not abusing you all day long, every single day. They take moments. Yeah, they take moments to do that, and they should not. Sometimes it depends. It depends on the person. Sometimes I have to tell them, they probably do love you, but their love is a little distorted, and that's not the way you love a 6-year-old or whatever it is. And so they're doing these things because they also are sexually gratified by you, but they need to limit that to adults. So, but the first thing you do is give them permission to feel the way they feel, and to acknowledge that they do feel that way, and that it's not unusual. It isn't. It really isn't. I'm surprised at how many kids want to go back with whatever perpetrator that physically abused. They still want to go home. I work with a kid right now. Her mother is horrible and extremely narcissistic, and she's so upset because her mother hasn't wished her a good first day of school, even though she's very glad to not be living with her anymore. Because you know what? You want to know, this is what they want to know. They want to know that what they thought, the relationship they thought they have, that at least part of it was true. Because in a sense, it allows you to trust yourself. If you can't even trust yourself, that's really frightening, because you're just very, very vulnerable. So you want to at least know that part was genuine. And some, you know what? Often it is. They don't know how to, a lot of perpetrators don't know how to connect with adults. They only know how to connect with kids. And they need connection too. So that's why they do it. They just also happen to have sexual appetites, and they take advantage of the children in that area. So it's not that it's not a legitimate connection. It's just that it's a connection that has extra components it should not have, that are either illegal, immoral, or both.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Diane. We would like to thank you very much for your conference. It was a very interesting and very learning conference. And we really want to thank you. It is an honor that you have shared your time with us. And we thank you very much.
No, you're
para
welcome.
todos los demás, vamos a hacer un receso para la comida y regresamos a las 4:30 de la tarde para la próxima conferencia con la señora Debbie Fox. Muchísimas gracias a todos y buenas tardes y buen provecho.
Adiós.
Bye bye, Diane.
Diane, can you wait 1 second? Please?
Yes.
Thank you.
I noticed that somebody asked a question about Dan Siegel's exercise. It's
yes, this was cited by Bessel van der Kolk in the Brian Keeps the Brian Keeps the Score.
The body, the brain keeps the score, or the body keeps the score. Yeah. Yes, there's a Dan Siegel exercise where he just says the word yes and no, but he says it with a different tone. And so what I'll do is he first of all has you take a deep breath and relax, and then he just says, no. And when I do this with an audience, they just jump. And then I say, okay, does that feel good or bad? No, it feels terrible. Where do you feel it in your body? Usually somewhere in your torso. And then I switch to yes. And you can feel yourself calm down. And then I say, imagine living at no all the time. Because when you have this early start in life that is disruptive and dangerous, that's your set point. That's where you are when you're calm. And then it gets worse from there. So that's the exercise. But it's hard to do online.
Okay, there's another question, Diane. What is the treatment for children with sexual abuse? The group therapy is an option, and the parents also?
Yes, okay, so group therapy, first of all, sometimes people need individual, they really do. If you can get group therapy with good group cohesion, some process and a little psychoeducation, because it normalizes it for people, but some people need a little more attention, so they may also need individual, but group therapy is really good. also working with the family, because therapy is 1 hour a week and then that kid goes home to people who may be undoing everything you just did. So you've got to work with families so they understand their child's behavior, why the child is acting that, why are they lying, for example? Well, okay, so you've got to work with them on that, work with them on how to respond to that child, how to help that child regulate. But and also very often you have to work with the school, because that child takes those symptomatic behaviors everywhere. And I remember working with a mother who said that her teacher thought she had ADHD because she couldn't sit still. But the reason she couldn't sit still is because her bottom hurt. So, so you may have to work with the school, obviously with the permission of the parents. You have to work with the parents. You have to work with the people, what we call the therapeutic web, which is where that child spends time. Because you've had one adult basically more or less ruin a child's perception of relationships with adults. And so, and because your brain gravitates towards the negative to protect you more than the positive. So then you're going to have lots of experiences of positive interactions with other people that are corrective to override that neural pathway that says that adults are dangerous and scary. So, and we talk a lot about grooming. We talk about normalizing behavior. And we talk a lot about what was it like to tell, how did other people respond, and how did you deal with that, and what was that like, and kind of normalize what those other people did, how it affected you. It's really, it's quite a complex, but it's fun, but it's pretty complex. And it depends on each individual. When you're working with small children, though, I would say at least under the age of 8, play therapy. I would go with play therapy first. Because kids, while they can't necessarily, are not good with using words, their play will tell you. And it's fascinating. So child-centered, non-directed play therapy is an excellent way to go with young children.
Thank you
and
very
that
much.
can be done easier in individual than group.
Thank you very much, Diane. People is asking me if you can share with us your email or your contact number.
Mm-hmm. Yes, email is, oh my goodness. Can I?
You can put it in the chat.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the chat. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble today. I use Zoom all the time. I see Q&A. I don't see chat, but I will.
Okay, in Q&A if you want.
Yeah, it's here. DT. Oops, neurosequential. Is that right? Neurosequential.net. There you go. Okay, did it come up? Send, there we go. I love art therapy. I highly recommend that. Highly recommend art. Did my email address come up somewhere? I don't see it.
No, you didn't do it.
Let me do it again. Okay, send. No. I still don't see it. I keep hitting send. It says type answer. Let me do this, answer live. Okay. Well, let me just spell it. It is D like Diane, T like Teresa, V like Vines, Victor. So DTV at neurosequential, DTVUENTIAL.com.
DTV@neurosequential.com.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, Diane, for your time, and we appreciate very much. See you soon.
Of course. Thank you, and thank you for the technical help. What a mess.
Diane,
Thank you very much.
just one
Thank
question.
you.
Diane, sorry,
Sure.
is .com or .net?
It should be .com.
Because you write .net.
Did I? Okay. It should be .com. I'm
Okay.
sorry. That was a
Don't
mistake.
worry.
It's .com.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you very
You're
much.
welcome.
Gracias a todos por estar con nosotros y regresamos a las 4:30. Gracias. Buen provecho.